Welcome to my channel. I'm Nancy Reed, your storyteller of folk tales, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of topics. Join me for today's story. Out in rural Lincoln County, there lived a brother and sister. The older brother was named Daniel Danny Reed, and his younger sister was Abigail Abby Reed. Their parents passed away when they were young, leaving the two of them to fend for themselves. Back in the day, they were so poor they had to scrape by, sometimes begging for scraps, barely making it from one meal to the next. The folks in their small town pitied the pair and often lent a hand when they could. Now, both Danny and Abby are grown up. It's been a long time since they've had a proper meal like you'd hope for. They've managed to clear a few acres of wild land up on the ridge, planting whatever crops they could to get by. When things get busy, the siblings head out to the fields together, working side by side. In their downtime, they chop firewood, gather wild herbs, pick berries, whatever they can find, and haul it all down to the nearest city to sell. It's enough to scrape together a little cash for the basics. Life isn't lavish by any stretch, but they found a quiet kind of happiness in it. Danny Reed just turned 18. Back in those days, that was about the age folks started thinking about settling down and starting a family. But with their family being dirt poor, no one had come knocking to ask for his hand. Abby, though, was a different story. At 16, she was a real looker, hardworking too. A girl like her was bound to catch some eyes. Naturally, plenty of suitors came calling for her. But Abby wasn't in any rush to talk about marriage. She was worried about her big brother. She'd sworn to herself that as long as Danny didn't find a wife, she wouldn't tie the knot either. A local matchmaker got wind of this and came up with an idea. Abby could trade marriages to set Danny up. Abby thought it over and figured the matchmaker might be onto something, so she agreed. Danny, though, wasn't having it. Trading marriages didn't sit right with him. It usually meant the other family was either broke or the guy had some serious baggage. Abby told him, "Hold off on saying no, Danny. Let's at least meet the folks from the other side and see what's what." After some convincing from his little sister, Danny gave in and said he'd go check it out first. So, they headed to the matchmaker's place. The other siblings were already there waiting. The sister was a knockout, drop-dead gorgeous, and the brother wasn't half bad either, real handsome. Danny got a funny feeling about it, like something was off. He asked the matchmaker straight up, "Are these folks poor or what?" The matchmaker grinned and said, "Look, these two are easy on the eyes, no question about it. But yeah, their family's flat broke, just like yours, ain't it?" Danny shook his head and said, "Nah, let's call it off. I'd rather stay single. I want Abby to marry into a good family. She's had it rough since we were kids. I can't stand the thought of her suffering after she's wed. My conscience wouldn't let me sleep." The matchmaker shrugged and said, "What's being poor matter? Long as they're willing to work hard, things y'all get better down the road. A rich family can still raise a rotten apple and squander everything, end up just as broke in the end." Abby chimed in, "She's right, Danny. Poverty ain't a life sentence. With a little grit, we can turn things around. Our days'll keep getting brighter." Between the matchmaker's smooth talk and Abby's pleading, Danny finally caved. "All right," he said, "I'll go along with this marriage swap." Both sides were old enough to give it a shot, so after some back and forth, they settled on a wedding date. It was coming up fast. The big day was almost here. Both families agreed to swap brides, and soon enough, the girls were picked up by their new in-laws. On her wedding night, Abby sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for her groom to lift the red veil. But she waited, and then came the bombshell. Turns out, the guy she was supposed to marry had hired a stand-in. The real groom was some sickly fella on his last legs. The Thompsons, the family she'd married into, had set this up just to give their dying son, Tommy Thompson, a proper send-off. When Abby found out the truth, her heart sank like a stone. She wasn't afraid of hard times, but she couldn't stomach a husband like that. Thinking about the life ahead of her, tears streamed down her face like a downpour. Old Lady Thompson, the groom's mom, stormed in, fuming. "Today's supposed to be a happy day, what are you bawling about?" Abby felt tricked, cheated by a family pulling a fast one with this sham marriage. She wanted to bolt right then and there. But then she thought about Danny, how he'd finally gotten a wife he liked. For his happiness, she swallowed her tears and choked them back down. Meanwhile, Danny had himself a beautiful bride. He was over the moon about it. Gently lifting her red veil, He grabbed 2 glasses of wine and said, "Sweetheart, it's getting late. Let's have a toast and call it a night." But his new wife, Janet Thompson, didn't look thrilled like a newlywed should. She grabbed her glass, downed it in one gulp, and stayed quiet. Danny could tell something was up. "What's wrong?" he asked. Janet sighed and said, "Your family's so poor, how are we gonna make it work?" Danny jumped in quick, "Don't worry about that. I ain't afraid of hard work. I'll hustle and make sure you've got a good life, I promise." Janet muttered, "Well, I hope you can back that up." That first night, she was cold as ice, but she still went through the motions of being a wife. Danny got where she was coming from and didn't hold it against her. He swore to himself he'd grind it out and earn enough to keep her happy. Danny was up before dawn every day, out working till the stars came out. He busted his hump just so Janet could have a better life. But Janet didn't seem to care much for his efforts. She lounged around the house all day, doing nothing. Danny'd come home beat, and he'd still have to cook dinner and wash the laundry. Not a peep of complaint out of him though. As long as Janet stuck around, he was content. On top of that, Abby was scared Danny might find out the truth about her situation. After her wedding, she stopped swinging by to visit him. Whenever Janet headed back to her folks' place, Abby made her promise not to spill the beans to Danny about what was really going on. But you can't keep a secret forever in a small town. Word got around, and Danny eventually heard about Abby's rotten deal, how she'd ended up hitched to a guy with one foot in the grave. It tore him up inside, but by then, there wasn't much he could do about it. All he could do was cry quietly to himself. One day, after selling off a load of firewood, Danny picked up a box of pastries from a shop in town. He figured he'd drop by Abby's place at the Thompsons to check on her. But as he got close to the door, he heard her sobbing in the yard. His heart dropped, and he bolted inside. There was Abby, crumpled on the ground, bawling her eyes out. Old Lady Thompson was standing over her, whacking her with a stick. Danny saw red. He stormed over, yanked the stick out of the old woman's hands, and yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" He helped Abby up off the dirt while Old Lady Thompson stumbled back from the shove and plopped down hard. She started wailing, slapping her thigh. "What are you gonna do about it? Everybody, come look. This jerk's beating me up. How am I supposed to face folks now?" Neighbors heard the commotion and came running to see what was what. Old Lady Thompson pointed at Danny and hollered, "Take a good look, this is my fine son-in-law trying to kill me." Danny shot back, "Why re you hitting my sister? What did she even do?" The old woman jabbed a finger at Abby, teeth gritted. "She's ruining us. That greedy little, wasting good food like it's nothing." Turns out, Abby had sprinkled a handful of flour into some wild green stew she was cooking. Old Lady Thompson caught her and flipped out, calling her a spendthrift and laying into her with a stick. Danny didn't want to waste another breath on her. He grabbed Abby's arm and started pulling her toward the gate. Old Lady Thompson shrieked after them, "You leave, don't you dare come back. I'm telling you now, I'll drag my daughter back home and cut ties with you for good." Abby heard that and panicked. She turned to her mother-in-law, begging, "I messed up, all right? I won't go, please don't take Janet away." Danny cut in, "Abby, come on, let's get out of here. I'd rather stay single forever than let you rot in this dump." Abby knew she was already in deep. She didn't want to wreck Danny's happiness too. She tried calming him down, pleading, "Just go home, Danny. Don't tell Janet about this, okay?" At her insistence, Danny finally backed off and left. Before he went, he said, "If they treat you like this again, you come home. You hear me?" Abby nodded. "I'll be careful from now on."
"I'm fine. Don't worry about me. You and Janet just life good, all right."
And so, the swap went down. But Abby's life with the Thompsons and Janet's with Danny?
Night and day.
Janet didn't lift a finger. Danny fed her every last bite of food they had. Meanwhile, Abby slaved away every day, stuck eating scraps and taking beatings from Old Lady Thompson. She put up with it all though, for Danny's sake. One day, Abby was out working the fields when she spotted a guy passed out in a ditch. His clothes were fancy, good fabric, but torn up and filthy, like he'd taken a tumble. Abby's heart was too soft to just walk by. She knelt down and shook him awake.
The guy came to, lips cracked and the mumbling for water.
Abby hustled over to the creek, scooped some up in a big leaf, and brought it back. After a few sips, the guy perked up a little. Turns out his name was Trevor Price, a businessman from the city. He'd been passing through on a deal when a gang of thieves jumped him. They snatched his bag, and in the scuffle, he'd taken a bad fall down a ravine. Now he was banged up and couldn't even stand. Abby wanted to take him back to the house, but the thought of old lady Thompson made her hesitate. Instead, she helped Trevor hobble over to an old run-down shed nearby. She grabbed some herbs and patched him up as best she could. Trevor was in rough shape, too hurt to move far, so he stayed put in that shed. Every day, when Abby went out to work, she'd sneak him a bit of stale bread or a roasted sweet potato she dug up. Trevor couldn't thank her enough. "If it weren't for you, I'd be a goner," he said.
I owe you big time. I'll pay you back someday.
Abby just brushed it off. Anyone would have done the same. It's nothing special, you don't need to keep it in mind. Trevor holed up in that shed for over 2 weeks. His wounds started healing up, and when Abby checked in on him next, he said he was ready to head home. She knew he didn't have a dime on him and wanted to help, but she was flat broke herself. All she could do was pull a few sweet potatoes from the ground, cook them over a fire, and hand them over for his trip. While Abby was roasting the potatoes in the shed, old lady Thompson came charging in, mad as a hornet. She was waving a broomstick, yelling, "So you're the thief raiding my pantry."
Greedy little. Think he won't beat you senseless today.
She swung the stick right at Abby, but before it could land, Trevor grabbed it mid-air. Old lady Thompson froze when she saw him. Then she went off even worse.
Oh, I get it now. You're hiding some Wildmann in here. I aukta drag you bot to the sheriff.
She dropped the broom and latched onto Trevor's fancy but tattered shirt, trying to haul him out. Folks working nearby heard the ruckus and came running. Old lady Thompson, with an audience now, got louder. "Look at this, everybody. This shameless pair, carrying on right under my nose. I'm taking them to the law today. I'll get justice for my poor boy." Trevor raised his voice. "Hold up, folks, don't get the wrong idea.
Me and Abby ain't done nothing wrong."
He explained how she'd saved him after the robbery, start to finish. Old lady Thompson wasn't buying it. "Don't give me your excuses."
I kaukt you red-handed. Trepsilon talking your way out of this with the sheriff.
Trevor saw she was beyond reason. He shook her off and said, "I told you, I've got nothing going on with Abby."
"She's my life-saver. Tatsi te."
Old lady Thompson knew she couldn't drag Trevor to the sheriff all by herself. She turned to the crowd and barked, "Somebody keep an eye on these two, don't let this cheating rat slip away. I'm heading to the sheriff's office to report this." After she stormed off, Abby whispered to Trevor, "Trevor, you gotta go now." Trevor frowned.
"If you take off, shall I make your life hell?"
"We didn't do anything wrong. I ain't scared to face the law." Abby knew how ruthless old lady Thompson could be. She begged him, "Please just go. Trust me." Around town, old lady Thompson had a reputation as a real tyrant. She'd chew out anybody over nothing. Folks called her the living queen of mean. Most people steered clear of her, and plenty felt sorry for Abby. The neighbors chimed in, urging her, "Abby, go with him. Get out of here, stick it to that old hag." But Abby shook her head.
"I haven't done a nyting bad. If I ran, it'll look vase. Plus, I can't lead any behint."
She turned back to Trevor, pleading, "You've got to get out before the sheriff's men show up. It'll be trouble."
"Trevor seid. I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess.
"I'll make it up to you, I swear." With Abby pushing him, he finally took off. Turns out, old lady Thompson didn't even make it to the sheriff. She'd gotten sidetracked, heading home to grab some rope instead. She rounded up her husband to help tie Trevor up and haul him in. By the time they got back, though, Trevor was long gone. Old lady Thompson was spitting mad. She turned on Abby, cursing and swinging at her. After the beating, she tied Abby up with the rope and dragged her back to the house. Once they got there, she laid into her again, then locked her in the woodshed. 3 days, no food, that'll teach you," she snarled. Abby sat in that shed for 3 days and nights, starving and weak, slumped on the floor. She thought maybe dying would end her misery. But then she pictured Danny. If she was gone, Janet would ditch him for sure. That kept her hanging on, too stubborn to give up. Right when Abby was fading out, old lady Thompson burst into the woodshed screaming, you little tramp.
You killed my boy, I'm gonna make you pay.
She and her husband yanked Abby into the house and threw her down on the floor. Turns out, Tommy Thompson had finally kicked the bucket. Old Lady Thompson pinned it all on Abby, howling that she'd driven her son to the grave with her so-called wickedness. Abby took a beating till her head was bleeding, sprawled out crying her eyes out. Tommy's body sat in the house for a week before they buried him. After the funeral, Old Lady Thompson glared at Abby and spat, "You broomstick of bad luck, you took my son.
Now you're gonna live out your dieses highest video.
Don't even think about chasing after another man." Abby knew this was her lot now. Old Lady Thompson's curses and blows had numbed her. She went through each day like a walking corpse, no hopes, no highs, no lows. One afternoon, she was down by the creek washing clothes when a guy in his 60s rolled by with a younger feller in tow. The old man couldn't take his eyes off her. That was Lloyd Baxter, a big-shot landowner from the city. Most of the farmland around town belonged to his family. He'd come out that day with his assistant Jimmy to collect rent. When he spotted Abby, pretty as a picture despite her rough life, he was hooked. Drooling a little, he muttered to Jimmy, "Well damn. If she catches my fancy, I'll marry her and bring her home." Lloyd swallowed hard and said, "That girl's a stunner. Jimmy, tail her and find out whose house she's from." Abby noticed them staring and grabbed her laundry quick, hightailing it back home. Jimmy followed close behind, then reported back to Lloyd. Lloyd didn't waste time, he went straight to a matchmaker in town. She filled him in on Abby's deal.
Lloyd grinned, "I want that girl. Video or not, I don't care. Make it happen, and he'll hook you up good."
The matchmaker showed up at the Thompsons' place. Old Lady Thompson's eyes lit up when she heard the pitch, but she played it coy. "If I let her go, who's gonna take care of us in our old age? Tell Lloyd if he wants her, it'll cost him $50 for our retirement."
The matchmaker warfed it off. "Don't sweet it. Lloyd Baxter's loaded.
He'll pay up, and you'll be rid of her and set for life.
Win-win, right?"
Old Lady Thompson smirked. "He brings the cash, he can take her whenever." The very next day, Lloyd Baxter showed up at the Thompsons' door with the cash in hand. Old Lady Thompson saw the money and turned on the charm, all smiles. "Well, ain't you a straight shooter, Mr. Baxter? She's yours today, no delays on my end." She called Abby out, ready to hand her over. Lloyd was thrilled, practically bouncing. He'd brought a big red pickup truck to whisk Abby away. For Abby, life with the Thompsons had been a living hell. Being sold off now didn't even faze her. She couldn't fight it anyway, so she climbed into the truck without a word. Lloyd's first wife had passed years back, and he'd never remarried. His son was grown and hitched, so Lloyd figured it was time to treat himself to a new bride. He'd fallen hard for Abby at first sight. Back at his place, the Baxter house was decked out in red streamers, buzzing with excitement, way more than when he'd married his first wife. Big names from the city rolled in to toast the occasion. Lloyd couldn't wait for the sun to set that day. He was itching to get to the honeymoon. When the guests finally cleared out, he made a beeline for Abby. He lifted her red veil with a grin, saying, "Hey beautiful, it's our wedding night. Time's worth its weight in gold, let's hit the hay." He reached for her hand, but Abby flinched away on instinct. Lloyd didn't get mad. "Don't be scared, darlin'. I'll treat you right. You've had it tough, I'm gonna make sure you've got a good life from now on." Just as he was about to make his move, there was a loud knock at the door. One of the help called out, "Boss, your son's back." Lloyd straightened up, fixing his shirt. "My boy's home. Come on, I'll introduce you, he can meet his new stepmom." Abby didn't want to budge, but Lloyd grabbed her hand and pulled her along. His son, Luke Baxter, had been off in the city on a big business deal for months. Now that he was back, Lloyd was over the moon and wanted to show him off before heading to the bedroom. They walked into the main room, and there stood two young guys. One was Luke, Lloyd's son. The other was a stranger to Abby, until their eyes locked, and both froze. That stranger was none other than Trevor Price, the guy she'd saved by the creek. After getting home, Trevor couldn't shake Abby from his mind. He'd tagged along with Luke this time, dead set on pulling her out of that mess. Never thought he'd run into her here.
"Abby,"
Trevor said, stunned. Abby didn't know what to say, she just dropped her head. Luke glanced at Trevor and asked, "You know her, man?" Trevor nodded. "Didn't I tell you? Few months back, a good-hearted girl saved my hide. That's her, Abby." Luke couldn't believe the coincidence. No way it's that small a world. He grabbed his dad and pulled him aside to a back room. Lloyd was confused. "What's so secret we can't talk out there? What's going on?" Luke took a breath. "Dad, you can't marry her." Lloyd's face turned red. He'd finally found a girl he was crazy about. Why the hell not? "What are you saying, boy? This ain't your business." Luke held up a hand. "Listen, she's tied to our family already." Saved Trevor's life. Turns out, when Luke was in the city, some local crook nearly took him down with a shady lawsuit. Trevor's family had pull up there, big shots who could call shots. Trevor stepped in, hating to see an out-of-towner get bullied, and bailed Luke out. That deal went through, made Luke a pile of cash, and the two hit it off as buddies. Trevor had mentioned Abby to Luke, saying how he'd fallen for the kind girl who'd helped him. He'd come back with Luke to track her down and marry her himself. Never crossed his mind she'd end up his buddy's new stepmom. To repay Trevor's favor, Luke knew he had to talk his dad out of this. Lloyd cooled off after hearing it all. He didn't want to let Abby go, but he couldn't steal her from the guy who'd saved his son's bacon. Back in the main room, Trevor asked Abby what was up. She spilled everything that had happened since he'd left, sold off like cattle by old lady Thompson. Trevor's heart broke hearing it. "I came back as soon as I could," he said. "Didn't want you suffering anymore. I'm here to take you away." While they talked, Lloyd and Luke came back out. Lloyd clasped his hands at Trevor. "Mr. Price, thank you. Luke filled me in. You're a hero to our family." Trevor waved it off. "Just doing what's right, no big deal." Lloyd called for the staff to whip up a feast. "We're treating you right tonight," he said, then told a maid to show Abby to a guest room. Trevor watched her go, feeling a pang. She was hitched to Lloyd now, he couldn't just swoop in and take her. He started knocking back drinks, and Lloyd and Luke could see what was eating him. Luke tried to lighten the mood. "Trevor, pace yourself, man, you've still got a wedding night ahead." Trevor gave a bitter laugh. "What wedding night? Looks like I'm out of luck here." Lloyd clapped him on the shoulder. "Trevor, you're staying over tonight. You're the groom, our house gets to share in the celebration. It's late, Abby's waiting on you. Luke'll show you the way." Trevor blinked, half drunk, thinking he'd misheard. He sobered up fast, bowing low. "Mr. Baxter, thank you." Lloyd pulled him up quick. "Don't do that, you're killing me with the formality. Get up. Lucky you boys got back when you did, or I'd have been in a real pickle tonight." He chuckled, and Trevor and Luke joined in. Luke grinned at his dad. Maybe this was meant to be, huh? Then he led Trevor to the guest room. Abby's jaw dropped when she saw Trevor walk in. Luke smirked. "Trevor, make the most of it, time's precious. I'm out." After he left, Trevor took Abby's hand. "Sweetheart, will you have me as your husband?" Abby blushed and looked down. "I'm a widow, I don't deserve a guy like you." Trevor shook his head. "You're the kindest girl in the world. You deserve every good thing there is." He pulled her into a tight hug. Abby felt his heartbeat pounding, like it was all a dream. Tears welled up, and she couldn't get a word out. Trevor smiled. "Honey, I'm gonna treat you right from now on, make you the happiest woman alive." They sealed the night with love, tangled up in each other. It was a wild, beautiful mess, like fireworks and peach blossoms all at once. Come morning, Trevor said goodbye to the Baxters and took Abby back to his family's place in the city. His folks knew she'd saved his life and were beyond grateful. Seeing how smart and sweet she was, they adored her right off. They threw a huge wedding for the couple, turned Abby from a small-town nobody into a shining star. Her husband and in-laws doted on her, and she lived a life full of joy. But Abby couldn't shake her worry about Danny. She talked it over with Trevor, and they decided to visit him and Janet. When they got there, though, it was just Danny at home, no sign of Janet anywhere. Danny broke down in happy tears when he saw Abby walk through the door. Turns out, after he'd heard the Thompsons sold her off, he'd gone into the city to track her down at the Baxters' place. They told him she'd married some big city guy named Trevor Price. Danny wasn't sure what to believe, half thought it was too good to be true, until he saw her standing there, safe and sound. When he'd gotten back from the city, though, Janet was gone. He asked around, and the neighbors said she'd taken off with some traveling salesman from out of town. Abby's heart ached for Danny hearing that, and Trevor stepped in. "Why don't you come with us to the city, Danny? You can learn the ropes of business with me." Danny tagged along. After a few months working with Trevor, he set Danny up with his own little shop. With some connections Trevor had, Danny even found himself a sweet girl named Emily, a real gem, and they got hitched. The two of them were crazy about each other, living a cozy, happy life. One day, Danny and Emily were out for a stroll in the suburbs when he saw a guy roughing up a woman. He couldn't just stand by, so he stepped in to stop it. Lo and behold, it was Janet getting knocked around. The guy snarled, "I bought her fair and square for $5. I'll do what I want." Danny pulled $10 from his pocket. "Take this and get lost." The guy saw the cash, grabbed it, and bolted. Janet looked at Danny, doing well now with a pretty wife by his side, and felt a wave of shame wash over her. She ditched him for nothing, and here he was thriving. Danny didn't bring up the past, though. He took her to a diner, bought her a meal, and got her some clean clothes. Janet teared up, sobbing, "I'm so sorry, Danny. Don't you hate me?" He shook his head. "Nah, everybody makes their choices." Turns out, she'd fallen for some smooth-talking drifter's promises and ran off with him. In the city, he'd pawned her off to a gambler who beat her daily. That guy sold her to the thug Danny just chased off, a butcher with a mean streak who'd knock her around for fun. She tried escaping, but he'd caught her and laid into her, right up until Danny showed up. Danny sent Janet back to her folks' place out of kindness. Old Lady Thompson clung to her daughter, bawling her eyes out. Word spread around town, and folks started pointing fingers at the Thompsons, calling them out for their dirty deeds. Old Lady Thompson knew Danny and Abby had made it big now, and it ate her up inside. She didn't last long after that, passed away early. Janet turned into the town pariah. Like a rat everybody wanted to swat. Well folks, that wraps up the first story. Now, Nancy Reed's got a second tale for you, don't miss it. I'm sure you've been hooked since the first one. The next story's called A Folk Tale. A groom's whole family hauled off at his wedding, and the bride cheerfully says, "Good job." Back in the old days, out in Willow Creek County during the colonial era, the local governor, Victor Kane, threw a fancy dinner party at his estate. Everybody was reciting poems and showing off their wits, trying to impress Governor Kane. But one guy, Samuel Carter, just sat there quiet, head down, eating his meal. Kane had seen plenty of folks in his time. Samuel might have been dressed in patched-up clothes, but there was something about him, tall, strong, like he was destined for more than this little town. So, after the party wound down, Kane kept Samuel back to chat one-on-one.
The two hit it off.
Samuel didn't just have a knack for words, he had a way about him that matched Kane's own style. But when the talk turned to family, Samuel got quiet, a little down. Turns out, the Carters had two boys, the older brother, James Carter, and the younger Samuel. Their parents scratched out a living farming, barely keeping food on the table after rent. Hard times hit when sickness took both folks a few years back, leaving the brothers on their own. Both boys were smart as whips though, passed every school test they took. James, the big brother, gave up his own studies to work odd jobs so Samuel could keep going. Now Samuel had just aced the county exams, but instead of celebrating, he was worried sick. The state exams were coming up next year, a real beast of a test, and with James's wife passing away not long after their wedding, it was just him and his sister-in-law Clara, holding things together. How was he supposed to make it to the capital and afford it all? Governor Kane slammed his hand on the table. "If that's how it is, Samuel, you stay here at the estate. Work as my scribe, copy books, make some money. Next year, when you head to the capital for the big exam, I'll cover the costs.
Just focus on your studies, Alrecht."
It was like a gift straight from the heavens. But Samuel shook his head fast. "Sir, I can't.
It wouldn't be right, a student, living here like that. Volkstalk, sei jure playing favorites. ID rata not stier abtrabbel."
Kane stroked his beard and chuckled.
"Don't want the gossip, who?
Fine, how about you marry into the family instead? Be my son-in-law." Turns out, Kane had a daughter, Victoria Kane, sharp and lovely, and he'd been looking to match her with someone worthy. If Samuel scored big in the state exams next year, she'd be the wife of a top scholar. A deal that good, who'd say no? Samuel didn't hesitate. He bowed deep. "Thank you, Governor, father-in-law." Cain was tickled pink. He told the housekeeper to set Samuel up with a quiet room out back for studying and made sure the staff treated him right. Just like that, Samuel went from a broke farm kid to the governor's future son-in-law overnight. People couldn't stop talking about it. Samuel settled in and wrote a letter to Clara back home, telling her not to worry. One day, while he was buried in his books, a servant popped in. "Sir, you've got a visitor from your hometown." They brought the guy in. It was Miles Parker, an old schoolmate from the county academy. They'd crossed paths now and then but weren't close. Miles came from money. His family owned half the trade in town. He only studied to rub elbows with the right people, help his dad's business. Back in the day, a poor kid like Samuel wouldn't have been worth his time. But now that Samuel was climbing the ladder, Miles showed up with a grin, acting like they were old pals. Miles had a reason for showing up. Back home, the county clerk job was up for grabs, and he wanted it bad. Thing was, the state picked clerks based on an exam, and the top score got the gig. Miles knew Samuel had a way with words, practically a genius. "Look, Sam," Miles said, leaning back, "you know I ain't much for books.
If he takes that test, I'm sunk. I need your help."
Samuel raised an eyebrow.
"You want me to heat for you?"
"Write your exam."
Miles laughed, waving it off.
"Nah, nothing that fancy, you're too good for that. Just put in a word with the governor for me. Get him to pull some strings, appoint me straight up. I'll make it worth your while." He smirked, pulling a fat stack of cash from his coat and slapping it on the table.
Samuel shook his head hard. "No dice, Miles.
The state's got rules. Cheating's off the table. Besides, Governor Cain's a straight shooter, he'd never go for it." Miles tried sweet-talking him every which way, but Samuel wouldn't budge. Finally, Miles lost it. "You're up on your high horse now, huh?
Forgetting where you came from."
They started yelling, right there in the governor's back room. A servant overheard and ran for the estate guards. Next thing Miles knew, they grabbed him and tossed him out the front gate. He hit the dirt, sprawled out like a fool, while folks passing by snickered. Miles, who'd lived cushy his whole life, had never been humiliated like that. Red-faced, he scrambled up and disappeared down the street. A month later, the clerk exam rolled around. Miles, with his half-baked learning, bombed it. Instead of owning up to his own mess, he blamed Samuel for not helping. The other students started giving him the cold shoulder. Nobody likes a sore loser. Miles stewed on it, itching to get even. One night, drowning his sorrows at a shady bar, he hit it off with a rough-looking guy named Travis Lane, a drifter hiding out from some trouble he'd stirred up back east. Travis and Miles got to talking over drinks, 3 rounds in, calling each other brother. Travis was a crook greedy, with a rap sheet for swindling women and worse. He'd made enemies all over and had nowhere left to run. Now, he was looking for a way to cozy up to Miles and his rich family. Miles, sloshed and bitter, let slip how he wanted to stick it to Samuel Carter.
Travis' eyes lit up.
"Don't worry, pal, I've got a plan to ruin that Carter kid for good. Once it's done, just let me crash at your place, maybe work for your folks."
"Deal." Miles, grinning like a fool, shook on it.
2 months later, Miles strutted back to the governor's estate, this time to see Victor Cain himself. He smirked all smug and said, "Congrats, Governor, on snagging such a fine son-in-law."
"Just curious. Your daughter marrying into the Carters, she gonna be the wife or the mistress?" Canes face darkened. "Kutze nonsense, Parker. I only let you in, 'cause I knee your old man."
"You keep flapping your gums like that, you think I won't have you hauled off." Miles just grinned wider. "Hey, people are tricky, you never really know 'em. Samuel Carter's a guy, think he doesn't hit the bars, chase a little fun to blow off steam." Seeing Cain's temper flare, Miles pulled out a rolled-up painting and spread it on the table. It showed a guy in rumpled clothes, half-drunk, leaning on a bar table. Next to him was a pretty girl fanning him, the two of them looking cozy as could be. The artist had skills, made it look real as life. Cain squinted at it. The guy seemed familiar. Then it hit him, Samuel Carter.
Wo's girl?
Where'd this come from? Who painted it? He demanded, barely keeping his cool.
Miles shrugged.
Came up at a friend's birthday a while back. I'm into art, so they got me this beauty as a gift. When I saw it, I realized, that's Samuel. We go way back, but I couldn't let him pull a fast one like this. Had to come tell you, save your daughter from getting played. Kane sent Miles packing and stormed back inside. He showed the painting to Victoria and told her what Miles said. She stared at it, a mess of feelings churning inside, and broke down crying. That lying snake, I should have never trusted him, she sobbed. Victor Kane was livid. He figured Samuel had played him for a fool. Part of him wanted to drag the kid through the courts, but he was the governor. Word getting out would make him a laughingstock.
Plus, itd. Tank Victorias chances of a decent mariage down the line.
So instead, he cooked up a flimsy charge and had Samuel locked up in the county jail, figuring he'd rot there quietly. Meanwhile, one of Samuel's buddies from the estate slipped out during the chaos and made a break for it. He hightailed it back to their hometown and told Clara Carter everything, how Samuel had been framed and tossed in a cell. Clara and James had been tight as siblings could be, and after he died, she'd promised to look out for Samuel. Hearing he was in trouble, she packed a bag and set off to spring him. But Willow Creek was a long haul from the capital, and Clara didn't know a soul there. She was running low on cash fast. Then, walking through town, she spotted a street vendor's stall and got an idea. She could paint to make some money. Her dad had been a big deal artist back home, and she'd picked up his tricks growing up, especially painting people so real they could step off the canvas. She set up a little table with cheap paper and ink and started sketching right there on the street. A woman painting in public wasn't common back then, let alone one as good as Clara. Pretty soon, a crowd gathered. Her portraits were so lifelike, folks couldn't help but shell out for them. In no time, she was the talk of the town. One day, a maid named Rosie was out shopping for the Kane household. She worked close with Victoria, who'd been moping around ever since Samuel's so-called betrayal. Rosie figured something new might cheer her up. When she saw the buzz around Clara's stall, she got curious and joined the gawkers. After seeing Clara's work, she was blown away. Victoria loved painting too. Maybe this artist could snap her out of her funk. Rosie walked up. "Hey miss, I'm Rosie, maid for the governor's family. My lady Victoria, she's into art too. Think you could stop by the estate for a bit?" Clara perked up at governor. Samuel was locked up under Kane's watch. If she could get in with his daughter, maybe she could plead his case. She nodded quick. "Sure, I'll come." When Clara got to the estate and met Victoria, something about her felt familiar, but Victoria couldn't place it. Rosie bragged up Clara's skills, so Victoria asked her to sketch some birds and flowers. Sure enough, they were so real they could have flown off the page. Gorgeous stuff. Victoria turned to compliment her, just as Clara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. That little move jogged Victoria's memory. It hit her like a brick. She'd seen it before, in that painting Miles brought. Could Clara be the girl with Samuel? To test it, she said, "Hey, can I paint you?" Clara hesitated. "Oh, I couldn't. Wouldn't want to embarrass myself in front of you, miss." Clara was a looker, but since hitting the capital, she'd kept it low-key, plain clothes, no fuss, to avoid trouble. Victoria saw right through the modesty and pushed her, finally convincing Clara to sit for a portrait. She even had her change into something nicer. Victoria was a dab hand with a brush herself, and quick as a flash, she painted Clara. When she finished, she studied it close. No doubt about it, Clara was the woman from Miles's painting. "Who are you really?" Victoria snapped, eyes narrowing. "What's your deal with Samuel Carter?" Clara froze, then slowly spilled the truth, begging Victoria to help free Samuel. Victoria's temper flared. She couldn't stand hearing his name. "You're all liars," she yelled, tears streaming down. She yanked the painting from a drawer and threw it on the table. "The barroom beauty," it said on the scroll. Clara gaped. "How'd my picture end up here?" Victoria jabbed a finger at it. "So it is you. Then the guy's gotta be that two-timing Samuel." Clara shook her head fast. "No ma'am, you've got it wrong. That's my husband, James Carter, Samuel's brother. They're twins, spitting images of each other." Turns out, after James quit school, he'd been down in the dumps. One night, he got plastered, and Clara painted him passed out at the table to tease him later. He'd liked it so much, he talked her into adding herself to the scene. That's how the barroom beauty came to be. Victoria clapped a hand over her mouth, realizing she'd pinned it all on the wrong Carter. Victoria didn't waste a second. She bolted to her dad's study, bawling, and begged him to let Samuel go. 10 days later, Clara dragged Samuel, still in his jail rags, back to their hometown. That's when she found out James had died of sickness while she was gone. A few days after that, she showed up at the Parker place in Widow's Black, looking for Miles. Miles's eyes lit up when he saw her. He'd heard Clara was a beauty, but seeing her in person, even dressed plain, was something else. That greedy streak in him perked right up. "What brings you here, Mrs. Carter?" he asked, playing it cool. Clara choked back tears. "My husband's gone. Samuel's all I've got left, and he's still locked up under the governor. I hear you've got connections, old school buddies, right? Can you pull some strings, get him out?" Miles paced the room, hands behind his back, then sighed. "You don't get it, Clara. Samuel crossed Governor Kane, big-time trouble. I'd love to help, but my hands are tied." Clara sobbed harder. "James only had one brother. If I can't save Samuel, how'll I face him in the afterlife?" Her crying, pretty as a picture even then, tugged at Miles, though he hid it. His mind raced, and he smirked. "Actually, there's one way to spring him. But you've got to do something for me." Clara's face brightened through the tears. "Anything, just name it, if it'll save him." Miles leaned in. "My dad's tight with Kane. If you'll marry me, be my second wife, I'll get him to talk to the governor and get Samuel out." Clara's face went pale, her head spinning. After a long pause, she nodded. "Fine, I'll marry you. But it's got to be official, a real wedding, out in the open." Miles, eager to lock down a prize like her, agreed to whatever she said. A few days later, the Parker estate was packed for Miles Parker's second wedding. Every big name they knew showed up for the feast. In a back room, Travis Lane, the guy who'd helped Miles frame Samuel, was chowing down with some hired hands, enjoying his cushy gig at the Parker place since the setup paid off. Travis had a dark past, swindling women left and right, racking up enemies across the state. He'd only stuck around the Parker place because it was safe, high walls, tight security, nobody dared mess with them. Today, with Miles tying the knot, the guards were extra sharp, so Travis felt safe enough to kick back and eat. One of his cronies grinned at him. "Boss, heard you're the one who got the groom's rival locked up. Spill the beans, give us the story." Travis, half drunk and full of himself, couldn't resist the spotlight with his crew egging him on. He laughed, loud and proud. "All right, boys, your family, no secrets here. Listen up." Flashback half a year, Travis had snuck into James Carter's place one night, figuring Samuel, the governor's golden boy, must have stashed some cash there from his new gig. He was wrong, didn't find a dime. But when he spotted the barroom beauty on the table, a light bulb went off. Not long after, Miles took Travis's idea and ran with it. He waved the painting under Kane's nose, claiming Samuel was a cheating dog. They bet on Victoria caring too much about her reputation to dig into it, and Kane, too mad to double-check, would just punish Samuel on the spot. It worked like a charm, the engagement fell apart, and Samuel landed in jail. Back at the wedding, though, things were shifting. Victoria had already cleared things up with her dad, and Kane had grilled Clara himself. Her story didn't match Victoria's at first, but it clicked eventually. They'd been played by Miles's scheme. To clear Samuel's name for good, they needed Travis, the puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. So Clara and Kane hatched a plan. She'd use her looks to cozy up to Miles, catch him off guard, and sniff out Travis's hideout. Miles, greedy as ever, took the bait and proposed. Clara played along, insisting on a big wedding to buy time. On the big night, while Miles was busy glad-handing guests out front, Clara slipped to the back. Sure enough, there was Travis, boozing it up with his boys. She sent word to Kane quick, time to move. Mid-brag, as Travis was soaking up his crew's cheers, the Parker estate got surrounded. Kane marched in, stone-faced, and gave the signal. Guards stormed the place, rounding up Miles, his dad, and Travis in one swoop. Travis heard the commotion out front and tried to bolt, but the guards had the back covered too. They nabbed him, tied him up tight with rope, and hauled him in. Miles cracked under pressure and spilled everything. Townsfolk who'd been pushed around by the Parkers for years came forward, piling on stories of their dirty tricks. In the end, Miles, his old man, and Travis all got slapped with the harshest sentences the law could throw. Clara watched Miles get his comeuppance and couldn't hold back a grin. "Good job," she said, half to herself. Evil got what it deserved. Bad guys couldn't dodge justice forever. She peeled off her wedding getup, swapped it for her plain clothes, and walked out of the Parker estate without a backward glance. The whole wedding circus was over. Samuel got out of jail, and despite Kane begging him to stay, he wasn't having it. He went back home with Clara to rest up and hit the books again. Kane sent folks a few times, trying to drag Samuel back to marry Victoria, but he turned them down flat. Later, Clara asked him why he kept saying no. Samuel sighed. "Kane's too quick to judge, turns on you fast. Marry Victoria, and I'd spend my life looking over my shoulder. Plus, I don't need handouts to make it. Real wealth comes from hard work, not hitching a ride with somebody else." He'd made up his mind to ditch the match for good. Clara told him not to sweat the bills. "I'll keep painting, you keep studying, we'll make it work together." Kane, when he heard why Samuel bailed, felt a pang of regret. Victoria threw a fit, insisting she'd marry him anyway, but deep down, she knew Samuel's ordeal had soured him on the idea for good. A year later, word got back to Kane that Samuel aced the state exam, top of the heap. Kane kicked himself. If he'd trusted Samuel from the jump, Victoria'd be married to the star scholar now. Too bad there's no do-over pill. Samuel climbed the ranks fast on his own steam after that, bringing Clara along to support him. They built a happy life, just the two of them. And that's the end, folks. If you liked my stories, drop a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.